Evolutionary Hardcore 2.0, episode 105 coming your way. Today we're talking about too much or too little trading volume by Euro-Pharma. So this is going to be a really good one. So Mobster and I, we're going to go over high and low trading volume definition. We're going to talk about too much or too little. We're going to talk about, do you need different approaches based on your body type? We're going to talk about Euro-Pharma steroids for different volume and give our thoughts and kind of debate that a little bit based on what your goals are. Which Euro Pharmacy steroids and stacks would work for you based on what you're trying to accomplish, and even based on your body types. We're going to give you lots of ideas that you can tap into for this one. And then we're going to talk about why Euro Pharma is so great. Why are we even talking about Euro Pharma on this podcast and recommending their products? But first, let's get into, high and low training volume definition. So Mobster is our training guru. He's been training longer than anyone out there. He's been training, since World War II, Mobster? So you know your stuff. You've tried every strategy out there. Mobster is
since
125
the
years old.
80s. since probably the Gulf War or the Iraq thing. Yeah, certainly. Listen, guys, I've looked at the science. I've studied the Arthur Jones stuff, the Mike Mensa stuff in terms of the heavy duty. Arthur Jones working at rep ranges. I've got books going back to the 1900s, and you can see approaches. You've got guys doing 4-hour workouts like Arnold Schwarzenegger. You've got other workouts that were literally 45, 50 minutes long, and so on and so forth, right? So part of the problem when it comes to training volume is we tend to copy without meaning to do so. And maybe it's a good place to start, Steve. The champions. Okay, we come into the sport with not much knowledge. Dorian Yates was probably one of the few top professional bodybuilders, Steve, who, apart from his brief spell in Borstal or prison or whatever the fuck it was, youth offender, I think it was, and doing a little bit of training in gym once in prison. Once he came out, he didn't train straight away. He was a bit of a roughneck, a skinhead, and doing whatever, but he actually had kind of a little bit of common sense where he went away and started reading about training and nutrition, and then later on, of course, steroids. He actually sat down and did some research. Now, of course, you're listening to the show, so you're doing research. You come onto the forums to ask questions, so you're doing research. And, of course, you have access to the internet in a way that Dorian never did back in the day, or any other pro bodybuilder up to this time, where you can go on to Google and you can literally read sports science studies and articles and everything else. Now, the problem is, and we know this is the case, Steve, information overload. So we can't, ironically, for guys that like to work out, we're a little bit lazy sometimes. It's a lot of work, and you're listening to the show, so you let myself and Stevesmi have got the experience, and we've done some of the research for you, of course, where we go away and we look at the reasons why we train certain ways. We kind of got a good idea of what works for most people. We have even a better idea, as we'll be discussing later on in the show, about different volume approaches just based on your body type, as Steve just said, and so on. Let me keep this fairly straightforward and simple just as a starting point. So as I touched upon at the beginning with my own introduction, Steve, we copy the champions. And that's probably the number one mistake that we start with. Genetic freaks, champion bodybuilders, champion athletes of any description, even if there's a skill-based element to certain athletes, require either a genetic advantage, i.e. if you're a golfer or basketball players being tall, a golfer doing 10,000 swings. For bodybuilding, quite often what we'll do is we'll look at someone that has a physical frame that's different from ours, has an ability to cope with a workload that we cannot, as normal Joes, cope with. And that's our starting point, Steve. So if, for example, and this is a thing that me and you've actually done in another show, when we talked about the magazines, and to somewhat of a lesser degree now, social media, both the magazines used to be quite often written by people that were not the champion, even if it was in the name of the champion. And sometimes with social media type videos, and I love the bodybuilding videos and the strength videos as much as the next person. They get me juiced up to go to the gym and kick ass. But for example, watching Jay Cutler train wouldn't benefit me. Watching Larry Wills train wouldn't benefit me. Watching the world's strongest man train benefit me a little bit, but it won't benefit most of our listeners as bodybuilders, for example. It's inspiring, but you're not necessarily, when it comes to the actual sets and reps, the actual volume of what's being done, help you. Sometimes, for example, Steve, we see things like, even if there's a relatively low volume approach in terms of the sets and reps, it's 6 or 7 exercises for one muscle. Whereas in reality, and this is actually supported by the science, by the studies, by sports scientists and sports physiologists, etc., 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 people with university dissertations and who've got their degrees on a specific aspect of literally sat down, sometimes with untrained individuals, sometimes working with athletes, and they can talk about percentages of workload, why this approach works better for hypertrophy in the average man, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
If you read, yeah, sorry, just before, if you read of a champion bodybuilder that does, as an example, Steve, 25 sets, that benefits him. Does it benefit you? So jump in with some of the stuff that we're talking about now before we get into the meat and potatoes of the argument.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in that now. It's the same thing with nutrition, and I try to explain this to so many people out there because they'll watch these famous videos of the bodybuilders going through the grocery store and food shopping. And the bodybuilder, he opens up the freezer and he grabs this frozen fish, that frozen fish. He'll go and grab these meats, that meats. He'll eat, he'll get so much food. He'll have like a $300-400 grocery bill, and it's all like tons of carbs, tons of protein, right? And and then people will try to emulate that. You know, a 20-year-old will watch that and be like, wow, I want to look like Jay Cutler. I'm going to try that diet. And then they get on that diet, and what happens? They just get fat on that diet, or they have tremendous amount of gut problems on that diet. So it's the same thing with nutrition as it is with the training. As Mobster mentioned, you cannot watch these guys train. If you train the way these professionals train, you'll end up injured. At best, you'll end up injured. And at worst, you're just going to stunt your growth because, listen, they've been training for years and years and years, since at least their preteens. They've been training, probably even longer, and they have tremendous genetics to be able to handle that. What's the difference between a 5-star athlete, okay, going into high school in any sport, who makes it to the NFL and has a successful 10-year NFL career, and the person who's a 5-star athlete going to high school who can't even make it in the NFL? It's not just, well, maybe they just aren't cut out for being a professional athlete, but a lot of that is injuries. A lot of that is they couldn't make it through college without injuries. Their bodies aren't made to handle that kind of stress of college football than professional football. Their bodies are made of glass and they get injured. They're injury prone. They've been injury prone throughout high school. They've been injury prone throughout college, and they're injury prone in the NFL. That's consistency. And some guys never get injured, it seems. They're able to have a long career as a professional. So, same thing with bodybuilding. So, don't try to emulate what these guys are doing. And as Mobster said, he said it perfectly. Look, and I'll add this. He said those videos that you see when they're training online, they're meant to inspire, but they're also, the main reason is they're meant to get clicks. Okay. They get
Yes.
clicks. They're able to lead people to their supplement line, to their coaching, and they can monetize it and make money. And of course, they can monetize it based on views. Because if YouTube, a lot of people don't know this, our videos that we have out there on social media, we don't monetize our videos based on the content we're putting out. We're putting out very, very underground content. So we're not going to monetize our videos. But when they put out training videos, that is monetized. So for every 1,000 clicks, it's about $1 they get, right? So when they put out a video that's crazy and they're lifting this crazy amount of weight and they get 1 million views, that's $10,000 that they're making off that video. So that's money. That's real money. That's good money. I mean, that's like a year's worth, a nice ass car, $500 a month car, for the year, or whatever the math is. So that's their car payment just off that one video. So yes, they're going to put out videos to get clicks more than putting out videos on how to actually train. So if you're new to training, or you've been training for 5 years, or you're new to steroids and you're going to start your first steroid cycle, and you think you're going to walk in there and train like Ronnie Coleman or Jay Cutler, you're in for a rude awakening. And you're probably going to, at best, end up severely injuring yourself, tearing a pec, destroying your shoulders, getting elbow injuries, getting inflammation in your knees or your joints or your hips, elbows, forearms, wrists, etc. And these are very common injuries that we get in the gym. These are common overuse injuries. And if you're training and you're getting overuse injuries, then obviously something is very, very wrong with your
Yeah,
training and you're listening
yeah.
to the wrong people. Go ahead, Master.
I mean, look, the obvious thing that you want from your training, if we put even the injury thing to one side, Steve, is you want results. If you are training to add muscle and the volume that you're using is inhibiting your ability to add muscle, then you're doing too much. If you're training to become strong, i.e., strength focused like myself, and the volume that you're doing is so high that your ability to increase your 1 rep max or even your triple or double rep max is inhibited, then your volume is too high. There are strength athletes that have trained 7 days a week. There are bodybuilders, even on our forum, Steve, that are looking like, oh, I train 5 days a week, but sometimes I do 6. And other people, oh, I've been out of the game for a while, so I'm going to train 7 days a week to catch up. And you and I say, listen, you're not getting enough rest. So as an obvious example, I'm going to use what we mean by too much or too little, just to explain that. Right. So high volume, low volume. High volume for me would be, Steve, 16 plus sets. And that can be made up of multiple exercises. Say, for example, 4 sets of one exercise, 4 exercises would be 16 sets. I think that's towards the higher end of what the average Joe that goes to a gym that wants to add muscle can probably get away with. And he needs to be looking in terms of percentages, somewhere between 70 and 80% of his 1 rep max. So as an example, and I use the bench press to illustrate this, if your bench is 100 kilograms, that's 2 plates aside, 225 if it's American 45-pound plates on a bar, that's your 1 rep max, then you need to be doing 100, you need to be doing 80% is 160 pounds, a little bit closer to 175, 180 pounds based on a 220-pound bench press. And then you need to be doing warm-ups and then working up to 4 work sets of 8 to 12 reps. You don't need to be looking at 20 reps because you're looking to endurance. You don't need to be doing 10 sets of 8 to 12 reps because, again, you're almost certainly overtraining and so on and so forth. You might look at other exercises, for example, dumbbell flies or some sort of pec fly machine. You might do some sort of dumbbell incline as well as a flat bench press. And you might even hit the grass and bang out some press ups at the finish or some sort of short chest pumping type movement, even dips, Steve. And then that would be 4 sets, four exercises, 16 sets. That's probably about the most. I'd actually might even go with 3 exercises for 4 sets, especially if you're training hard enough and it's in your percentage around 70 to 80% of your 1 rep max. Arguably, even the time is part of that consideration. So if you can do those exercises, that chest workout in 45, 50 minutes, maybe 60 minutes, your chest should be on fire. And providing your nutrition and your rest is good to go, you ought to have a response, a hypertrophic response, a muscle building response to that workout. If you're looking at 6 sets and you're only looking at, say, for argument's sake, 60% of your 1 rep max, so 60 kilograms instead of 100 kilograms, and 60 kilograms is 132 pounds, and you're doing similar percentages, similar volume again on the other exercises, you're probably not going to stimulate the level of muscle that you like to. It might arguably be almost more comfortable, less of an effort for you in the gym. And if, for example, that become a 75-minute or a 90-minute workout, again, you're probably not going to stimulate the amount of muscle that you want to. It's probably, I've even trained like that at the beginning of a training cycle, Steve, to work up the higher percentages of
Give
mass.
us give us an example.
Cycle.
Give us a
Yeah,
specific example, of percentage of weight that people and maybe you could do it in pounds since most of our
yeah,
listeners are American
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
aren't familiar with kilograms of how you would set the volume at 60, 70% so that they understand.
Let's use for example, I have actually done that, Steve, during the explanation. 132 pounds was 60% of the 1 rep max based on a 100 kilo or 220-pound bench press. As an example, I've talked about the sets, of course, already. I even used the 225 pounds. That's 2 plates each side of a bar for American listeners on the basis of 45-pound plates and a 45-pound bar.
But give an
Same thing.
example of give an example of the last couple of trainings
Let
you
me
did.
explain. Let me explain a higher percentage, for example. So, say for example, that listener, on the basis of the explanation I've just given, that's more bodybuilding. And what I would argue would be a stimulating, sensible percentage of volume, 80%, was one of the earlier explanations, versus 60%. 80% is going to stimulate muscle growth, 60% is not. And arguably, you might use 60% of your max for volume approach in terms of endurance. It would probably suit someone like yourself before, Steve, when you used to do triathlons, that higher repetition. It might even suit a boxer or fighter in terms of the higher repetitions, but without too much muscle being added. For example, as a fighter, you obviously have weight classes. But if I was using a higher percentage, let me give you another example then. So in the studies, using a higher percentage, 80%, 90%, 95%. We've had Casey Vital as a good example in the Colorado experiment, where he did I believe it was a 45-minute leg workout that even now is considered legendary. And I think he warmed up, he pyramided up on squats to a not fantastic weight. I believe it was 500 pounds, which is pretty good for most people. But then every exercise thereafter was only 1 or 2 sets. I believe it was something like 600, 700, 800 pounds on the leg press, 250 pounds, something like that on the leg extension, a good proportion of the weight, 160, 180 pounds on leg curls. And the whole workout, I believe, was 7 sets in total. The only reason it took 35, 45 minutes is because his heart rate was going so goddamn fast. He had to lay on the floor between a couple of the sets. And there was literally people taking him from one machine to the next, setting the machine up, putting the weights on the machine, letting his heart rate just come down just enough for him to be able to function and get his breath back and kill that workout. And you can actually Google that workout and you say, how the fuck did he do 7 or 8 sets total in 45 minutes of a workout that few of us can imagine ever singly doing? And then, because he had actually allowed his body weight to go down, he'd had an accident, increased his body weight, he was adding something ridiculous, Steve, like 2 pounds of muscle every fucking day of the experiment.
What was it?
So,
What's it called that they can Google it?
yeah, that's called the Colorado experiment. And you're specifically, if you need to add that, look, because there's other specific articles on it, but separately add Casey Vital to the search functions, to the search parameters. So the extreme end of that, and again, strength athletes tend to take their time during a workout. So there's a lot longer respite on powerlifters and strength athletes than it would be bodybuilders. You'd be looking at a much higher percentage, 80, 85, 90, 95% of your 1 rep max. So using that 2 plates aside on the bench press, 225 pounds for our American listeners, you'd be looking at a much higher percentage, so probably close to 200 pounds. And the volume would be relatively low. And low volume could be, for example, 4 to 8 reps, no more than 8 repetitions, just enough to maintain a little bit of muscle, but at the same time, when the lower repetitions, you're stimulating strength. And then, for example, even if you train as a bodybuilder doing that, the same exercises before, with bigger dumbbells on the flies, heavier weights on the pec fly machine, your body weight plus weight strapped you with a dipping belt on the dip, and so on and so forth. And again, a much slower workout. Now, it's a question of, and this should always be a question when it comes to training, is the workout with or without PEDs, with or without good nutrition, and with or without enough rest, is the workout stimulating the muscle growth? Is it making you stronger? So for the majority of our listeners, they're looking to add muscle. Is the volume percentage, the sets and reps, etc., you're doing sufficient to stimulate muscle? Now, here's the issue, Steve. Part of it is, number one, as I said right at the beginning, mimicking people with better genetics than you in terms of your volume. Number 2 is, and I've been guilty of this, I'm sure Steve has as well, I think the top of my chest needs a little bit of filling in, Steve, so I'm going to do more incline benching. Unfortunately, what happens, instead of doing flat benching and switching it to incline benching for a short period of time while you fill in the gaps in your physique, what some listeners do is they add incline benching, whether it's dumbbell or barbell, use the machine, whatever, to the workout. So the volume goes up, not because they've moved things around or they've deliberately decided to train with a high volume, but literally because they've added exercises to their routine. They haven't taken out another exercise. They get stuck with what they like. And I've been guilty of this, I'm sure you have in the past. And then we've added something to the workout. Then the workout goes from a 45 or 50-minute workout to an hour and a half. We're doing all these exercises and we're not seeing gains. And we can take PEDs so they come out of our ears and we can, increase the protein to 400 grams a day. But the simple argument is training equating to results. And you need to be able to identify that. There is even one more argument here, Steve. And again, the reason why we train certain ways is because we like to do those things. It's kind of almost a habit. I like lifting heavy weights, ergo, I use low volume and I lift heavy weights. But if I wanted to become a bodybuilder, if I wanted to add muscle, what I enjoy doing doesn't matter. So again, it might well be that we like to go to the gym. It might well be that we're training a certain way that we enjoy, but again, the end result. And this is a thing, and I'll bring Steve into this. True training of the correct volume that is stimulating muscle growth is uncomfortable. It is not a pleasant experience in and of itself. Doing a 45-minute workout with the numbers I suggested earlier on, doing the 4 exercises, is brutal. Your chest should be on fire. You should almost feel like you've got right down to the bone where the muscles attaching work, that kind of almost microwave steam feeling in the muscle. And that is very, very uncomfortable place to be. Talk about the hardest workouts that have produced the best results for you, Steve, and how you felt when you was doing them versus the pleasure of knowing you got through it and that you have stimulated the muscle afterwards.
Oh man, let me tell you something, man. When I was training for triathlons, it was you to bust your ass until you felt like you were about to throw up. And sometimes you would. You get on your hands and knees and dry heave during a run up a hill or something like that. And weight training is a lot a lot like that in terms of being uncomfortable in the gym. You can watch people train and see people, they'll be on a machine or they'll be doing free weights or whatever. And as soon as they start feeling uncomfortable, they stop. And I've trained with people like that. The burning sensation where that lactic acid's filling up that muscle and the blood is rushing to the muscle, it's uncomfortable. And a lot of people, they'll stop training. And we're going to talk about different PEDs in a second that cause even more pain while you're training. But what ends up happening is, people don't realize that the body is rebelling against you and the body doesn't like what you're doing. But what you're doing in the process is you're training your body to be more strong. Someone who just sits on their ass watching TV all day, smoking or vaping and eating, those little
Chips. Yeah, chips.
chips or those little
Yeah,
cookies that
chips.
come in those packages, little Debbie sweets that come in those little boxes. You're training your body to become weaker. You're training your body becoming more sick in the process. So you're weak as hell. So if that dinosaur breaks through your front door and you're sitting there in your couch, you're dead. You're not going to be able to get away from it, right? But if you train your body to be strong and fast and agile and have good conditioning, and you train it. You got to train it to be like that. Your body will adjust. Your body will get stronger. And a lot of people too, when they first join a gym, you ask any gym owner out there. We have a guy in our forum, JP. He owns a couple gyms. You can talk to him. I talked to him about this. Did you know that with gyms, the first month of people's memberships is when most people quit? Because what happens is they get in the gym and they're not seeing results because they're not pushing themselves because they don't know how to train. They don't know how to be uncomfortable in the gym. They don't know. And if they try to push themselves, they end up sore. They end up with these aches, these problems, and they just give up on it. But what happens is that's why you see gyms when they sign you up, they always want you to do a contract because they know that you're probably going to quit within that first couple months. You're going to quit or you're going to stop going. So you're going to want to cancel it. So that's why gyms always try to get you on a contract, right? A gym that doesn't give you a contract is a gym that's not going to last long, because they're going to lose most of their members. So
Yeah, they got to pay their bills, Steve. They got to pay their
yeah.
staff. And you coming in for a couple of training sessions and realizing the hard work and changing your mind and going back to the TV is not going to pay their
Yeah.
bills. They got to
And it's
cover
and
their
it's
asses.
and it's an adjustment. So when we talk about, approaching weight training, it's an adjustment too, because as you build your conditioning and as you get stronger, you have to also push yourself to the next limit and keep going and
Yes.
going and going. But on the flip side, once you get to a certain age, which I don't know what that age is going to be. For some people like me, it was about 35, 36 years old. That's when I blew out my shoulder. And I haven't been able to lift super heavy since. But someone like Mobster, he's going at 60 and he's still hitting new PRs. We got people on the forum, they're in their 50s and they're still hitting PRs.
Yeah.
And it depends. And it's not just about strength, it's about other things. It's about, do I want a 4-pack? Do I want a 6-pack? Well, if you want a 4-pack or a 6-pack, you got to be a little uncomfortable every day. You got to feel hungry every
Yeah.
day where your body has a reason to have low body fat. You got to do your stomach vacuums. You got to work your core, which is not very comfortable in the gym. Everybody hates training abs because you get that burning sensation of your abs, and no one wants to feel that core. Yeah, doing that Pilates workout where you're really working that core. I've done Pilates with skinny 115, 120-pound females, vegans, okay, who would beat the shit out of anybody listening to this podcast, including me and Mobster, when it
Oh yeah,
comes
yeah,
to
yeah.
having
Absolutely.
core
Yes.
strength, that deep core strength. Bodybuilders, they have these big muscles and strength and they could do a lot of weight, but their cores are weak. So it's all about approaching your training the right way. And it's not just about what you think, it's about
Yeah.
everything. Working the core. A lot of bodybuilders don't train their core at all. And what ends up happening is they end up with those physiques where you can see that they don't have that tight waist, on their physique. So everybody can do better when it comes to being uncomfortable and pushing themselves
Yes.
beyond what it takes. But then you have to kind of also, on the other side, you have to not overdo it where you end up injured. And you have to
Yeah.
realize these professionals, they're on so much shit and they have the genetics where they can get away with this crazy volume. So you absolutely need to take a different approach based on your body type, based on your genetics,
Yes, and
based
this is
on your
this is what
goal.
I'm going to talk about now,
Go ahead.
Steve. So the somotypes or body types, as some people call them, are essentially ectomorph, which is your lean, skinny, kind of angular, uh, loping around, looks like a basketball player type person to begin with. You've got the endomorph, which is the opposite, thick bones. Strength athletes tend to be endomeso, and this would be more likely the person that predisposition towards body fat, sometimes described as having an apple type shape, almost normal kind of upper body, then huge hips and belly and so on and so forth, and way more likely to be obese than the ectomorph. And then finally, the perfect shape, so to speak, the athletic shape, which would be the mesomorph. Now, no one or very few people are true ectos, true endos, or true mesos. Most people have a percentage, and arguably, Steve, the perfect bodybuilder is a combination of ecto, in other words, slim elbows, knees, and wrists to give you illusion. And the closest probably to that would be Flex Wheeler. And then obviously they also have the mesomorphic physique, which is the broad shoulder, the small waist, the small pelvis, but flaring thighs, flaring calves. And again, the small joints, but with big muscles hanging off those joints and having that athletic shape, that athletic silhouette is probably the perfect place. In terms of volume approach, and this is again where some of our listeners might be making a mistake, not to sound too preachy, but you might arguably, instead of copying the workout of a true mesomorph, i.e., the top professional bodybuilder, mesomorph, you might be more ecto or you might be more endo, meaning you might be more slim or more heavy built. And the volume approach that you want to take for those things is different. So, for example, if you are endomorphic, and I'll be crude just for the sake of illustration, fat, thick boned, heavy boned, etc. And again, great strength athletes, not necessarily great bodybuilders, although there are a handful. You probably need a higher volume because you tend towards less activity. You tend towards being less energetic. The ectomorph tends to be running around almost twitchy, Steve, can't sit still, etc. And so, therefore, the thing that's going to change you, the thing that's going to transform your physique, what certainly elicit a transformation, is going to be more volume. Whereas what most people that are listening to this show are actually going to be more likely to be ectomorphic. What do I mean by ectomorphic in terms of the common, what we will see on the forum, Steve, and what most of our listeners are like? Done a little bit of athletics, played a little bit of sport, have a smaller physique, not everybody, but again, a good percentage of our listeners, probably 60, 70% of our listeners and members on the forum are average height, and they want to add muscle, and they're not necessarily looking to be 220, 230 pounds, but they might want to be 180 pounds with a good physique, nice set of abs, good arms, broad shoulders, slim hips, etc., etc. So they're not endo and they're not meso. They're more ecto. They might have elements of endo in their physique. They might have elements of meso in their physique, but for the most part, they'll be ectomorphic, i.e. light frame. And this was especially true back in the day. Way more people that were kind of quote unquote scrawny and undersized wanted to become more muscular. The problem is that physique, that somotype, that body type doesn't actually benefit from a high level of volume. The mesos and endos do. The ecto, the lighter physique, does not. And you actually want lower volume. You want a higher percentage of your 1 rep max on exercises. It's easy enough without destroying yourself and killing your joints or whatever else to take an exercise. Let's say, for example, Steve, a perfectly normal Joe doing lat pull downs and work their way down to the stack until they can't do one more rep, one plate at a time, warm up, and then eventually get down to the middle of the stack. And then maybe after that, just do single repetitions of each plate until they can't go any further. Let's say, for example, it's a 200-pound stack. And that might be, if they're very fortunate and they're just testing their strength for the first time, 150 pounds. There's their 1 rep max, 3/4 of the stack. So the working weight would probably be 120 pounds. The person that's training as a obese individual or a more muscular individual could probably do 100 pounds and a lot more repetitions and still stimulate something versus the ectomorph, the average Joe, doing 120 pounds to that big high percentage of the 150 pounds, but doing multiple sets, perhaps changing the angles, perhaps doing other similar back exercises to stimulate muscle growth in the latissimus dorsi. It's that percentage of max done in the studies using normal individuals. You have to remember, listener, that you will have in most studies, for example, average people, big people, scrawny people, different body types. It shouldn't be one body type. It should be a percentage of endos, a percentage of ectos, a percentage of mesos. And you'll notice over time with those studies that some physiques did better with this percentage of reps and sets and so on and so forth, and bigger percentages of 1 rep max, and others did not. But again, the average listener, 60, 65, 70% of our listening audience will be ectomorphic and a lower amount of exercises, 3-4 exercises at the most, 8 to 12 rep range, 2 to 3, maybe 4 work sets at the most, done with a good percentage of your 1 rep max will benefit the vast majority of our listeners, especially if they get into the gym and they determine they're going to do 1 hour straight from one machine to the next as fast as they can, as soon as people are out of the way, up and down the dumbbell rack, loading and loading the weights relatively quickly. As soon as your breath is back, straight onto the next thing. You have to also remember in terms of, and Steve touched upon this a little bit earlier on, as did I, when I talked about how brutal this stuff is. The phrase I think that covers this, Steve, is getting out of your comfort zone. If you are, and again, Steve touched on it earlier, looking around the gym and you're seeing people training, great that they're there, great that they're in the gym, but their faces never screw up with the intensity of effort. They barely break a sweat. It's almost embarrassing to them if they look uncomfortable, if they are getting their phone out between sets, if they're not breathing hard, or as Steve said, bending over, trying not to spew. It doesn't have to be that uncomfortable, but it needs to be more uncomfortable than most people make it in that particular thing. And again, I use the forums as an analogy here, Steve. Sometimes we will post on the forums the highlights. We will, in social media, we certainly do this. What we not necessarily have done is posted when it was goddamn hard, when we were super tiny and it took ages to get big, how difficult it can be to eat all the food, how hard it can be when you're working and studying, whatever else, to get the rest that you need.
One of the things, yeah. One of the things I do when people train with me, sometimes I'll have a client train with me, sometimes I'll have a friend train with me or whatever. And one of the things I do is I'm like, let's go. Come on, let's go. I'm constantly doing that during the workout because when we're doing a workout together and I'm going in there and doing my set and I'm done, they need to be ready to jump in right away. I'm like, let's go. And then like even before the workout, we do the warm-ups and I'm like, all right, we gotta go. If you're not going, again, you're not conditioning your body. If you're just in the gym lollygagging and socializing and playing with your phone, you're not gonna be able to focus on it, especially as men. Because men aren't good at multitasking. We got to focus in on one thing at a time. We can't be juggling three, four things at one time. So put your phone away and focus on this fucking workout. We got to hit this. We just did a warm up and now you're lollygagging and wasting time. If you take too long to get into your workout, now you're gonna have to warm up all over again because now your muscles are gonna get cold again. So why are we lollygagging? We gotta go. So if I'm done with my set, you gotta jump in. You gotta jump in the machine, do your set. Don't waste time. And that's one of the things I have to push. Your body, you know, yes, in between sets, if you're going heavy, yeah, I used to take 5, maybe 6 minutes in between sets. And when I was going really, really heavy, I was going 2, 3 reps, on really heavy weight, heavy squats, heavy bench press. I needed time in between to let my muscles rest before I hit another heavy set. But if you're not, you got to get in there 30, 45 seconds, 1 minute max and hit it. You gotta keep it going so that your body has a reason to get stronger. It's not going to have a reason to get stronger if you're taking 10 minutes between sets and playing with your phone. So that's part of the things that I do that have to correct people on when I'm training with them.
Yeah.
Because
Let
you
me
got to
let me
remember, you're
finish. Yeah.
building up your brain has to work with your body. So if you're on your phone, you're taking 2, 3 minutes between sets and you're playing on your phone, your brain now is focused on something else. Your brain isn't focused on the workout, you see. So that makes a big difference. So you have to, it's like Mobster's ancestors. Well, you guys would march with armor and swords, okay, to go
Mhm.
kill the Welsh and the Scots and
Yeah.
the French and stuff. Do you think you stopped on the side? You know what? Let me just sit down here and I'm gonna sit and pull up my iPhone and play on my iPhone before battle. No, you're focused on the fucking battle. You're
Staying
marching. You're
alive.
ready.
Staying alive,
Exactly.
Steve. Not getting
Exactly.
killed.
There's like arrows flying in the air. They're getting shot in the butt. Remember in Braveheart, he got shot in the butt. That was your ancestor. Did he shoot the Scot in the butt?
I think
Is
there's
that
a
him?
phrase that says a gun in the face has a way of focusing your day right down to the nitty gritty, staying alive and dying.
So you're gonna
Let me,
go on your fucking
yeah,
iPhone and get shot in the ass with a fucking arrow. Then they
yeah.
have to pull the arrow out of your ass like they did in the movie.
True training to cause and effect where you will create, for example, muscle building, hypertrophy is brutal. True training, for example, with the high end endurance stuff like in the triathlons that Steve did, was brutal. And you will not transform your physique without making things uncomfortable. And that can mean brutal type stuff. And it's not made up of, and I'll use this example just to finish on this topic, Steve, before we talk about PEDs for different approaches and different body types. As an example, and I've commented about this on the forum, there was an average Joe, typical normal height, normal age, so around the age of 25 years of age, 160 pounds, that was doing 22 sets for arms. Now, one of our late members, and we've done a podcast on him, Monstro, aka Marco Louis, was a genetic freak and a high volume amount of PEDs, 5 grams a week or more. And Marco Louis, Monstro, was doing probably 25 sets of body part typically. And this is from his own mouth. And he's done this on shows and mentioned it online. But Marco was genetic freak. He had muscles on muscles and a six pack and an athletic shape in his teens when he was only eating, his own words against him, his mama's food. He looked like a short, muscular bodybuilder, 15, 16 years of age. The average Joe, and I'm talking about this particular member whose name I can't remember, 22 sets for biceps. No, no, that doesn't work. So you need to be doing stuff that stimulates muscle size, strength, or whatever, and make sure that your workout is focused in that way. It might require you to knock some stuff out. It might mean that you have to do an A and a B workout. It might mean you have to cycle strength or cycle your volume through the year in order to elicit the result, which for most people is muscle size, muscle growth, and be aware that you've added too much volume in or you've increased the volume, not using a high percentage of max because you become comfortable and you need to start being comfortable, as they say, Steve, with being uncomfortable. Let me talk about, and I'll bring Steve in for this as well, we discussed in the pre-show, and we, as a topic for today, different PEDs from Euro Pharmacies for different approaches. And then as an example, I love Anavar, and Euro Pharmacies does a great Anavar, Steve, Oxandrolix, which is great for strength. Love it. Works for me really well. There's a lot of bodybuilders that use it for muscle retention while they're training, and of course, they might train for strength at certain parts of the year. In terms of volume, in terms of the pump, Steve, it's so goddamn horrible when you get a pump. Certain pumps, especially back work on Anavar, it's horrendous. So, as an argument, and just to illustrate the point, and Steve mentioned the other one, which I'm going to mention now, which is Euro Pharmacies Dynabol. We said the pumps on Dynabol with a reasonable amount of volume are almost pleasurable. The pumps on Anavar with a reasonable amount of volume can be uncomfortable. So, for example, in that analogy, most listeners training for muscle growth would benefit in terms of orals in using Dianabol for size and volume versus Anavar. Let's talk about that, Steve, and talk about dosage and differences, etc., on that, just on these two orals.
Yeah. So what I noticed on these, if you're doing cardio with Anavar, lower back pumps, I mean, you can't even make it a mile before the lower back pumps hit. So if you want to do lots of cardio, it's not going to work. Dynabol is even worse with cardio because the calf pumps. Oh my goodness! I tried to run. First time I ran Dynabol, I went on the treadmill at my gym. I started jogging. Right, I was jogging, trying to jog 2 or 3 miles on the treadmill after a workout, and I had to stop. I was like, "What is going on? Why are my calves blowing up like balloons?" So I had to get off the treadmill, like get on the ground, right, and just lay there. My calf was so huge, it was like about to explode, right? And the veins in my calves were about to explode. And it hurt so fucking much. So, again, this is an example of, the pumps can be an advantage and it could be a disadvantage. So, one of the tricks that you can do is you can use some taurine
Yes.
on here, and that can help with the pumps. But look, at the end of the day, some people like the pumps, as Mobster said. I used to love training with either Dynabol or Anavar and just going high volume on my arms and walking out of the gym with my arms huge. I wasn't even able to fucking steer my car, but I would,
Scratch your head, Steve.
yeah.
Scratch your head.
But dude, like my arms were popping. I feel great. I put my head up in the air. The ego going. You're in front of the mirror. You're doing weights. You're doing curls in front of the mirror and watching your arm get bigger and bigger. That's a great feeling. So look, you got to be aware of that. So at the end of the day, some of you are going to hate it and some of you are going to love it. It just depends on what you're doing.
What about Steve? And they do a product which is called Turexel, which is of course Turinabol for a volume approach to bodybuilding.
Yeah. So
Talk
that's a
about
great
Turinabol.
one. Yeah. So Turinabol, the pumps are very minimal to none on Turinabol. So I've been able to use Turinabol to do a lot of sports, climbing, cardio, hot yoga, lots of things. If you like to be athletic, if you like to do high volume in the gym, low weights, high volume, Turinabol is nice because it doesn't give you those crippling pumps. So it can definitely be something that if you want to do high volume, I would go the Turinabol route. But also on the flip side, look, if you want to do a low volume, you could stack Turinabol with something like Tren and I've done that before, and you can strength train. And I've hit PRs doing Tren and T-Bol together. So it works really good. But T-Bol alone is pretty fucking weak, okay? D-Bol alone isn't weak. You're going to get results. Anavar alone isn't weak. You're going to get results. But T-Bol alone is pretty fucking weak. But that may work to your advantage if that's your goal. But at the end of the day, you could stack T-Bol. And Euro Pharmacies has many different options where you could stack T-Bol with something else. You could stack it with Test. You could stack it with Equipoise. You could stack it with Tren. It just depends on what your goals are. You can even stack it with a little D-Bol to give it a little punch.
Let me ask you now, Steve. If you was a high volume guy and high volume was working for you, which would be the best injectable and which would be the worst injectable that you use from again the Euro Pharmacies range for a high volume, good and bad?
Yeah, so I would go, since we haven't talked about it yet, I would go with Primo and Euro Pharmacies. The good thing about the Euro Pharmacies Primo is I've used Primo in the past, and I've used good Primo and I've used bad Primo. And the way I would categorize bad Primo is that it's fake because Primo is highly faked. But also, I categorize bad primo as being like motor oil, very, very thick, very. As soon as you inject it, the pain, the post-injection pain is instant, and then you're sore for like 3 or 4 days. So that'd be bad primo. So for me, using Euro Pharmacies Primo, it's as smooth as you're gonna find any Primo out there, and no problem on a 25 gauge needle. Okay, I've used Primo in the past where 25 gauge is not gonna work. You got to do 23 gauge because it's that thick. But Euro Pharmacy is an excellent Primo, so that would be a great option for high volume. And again, the side effects are low. So Arnold back in the 70s and a lot of these other guys in the golden age, they loved Primo for many reasons. But one of the reasons they loved Primo was for this exact reason, Mobster, what you said. They would go high volume and it gave good clean results without water retention. And the pumps were
Arnold
very
talked about
minimal.
4 hour workouts again and again and again, Steve. And even if he was psyching the guys out, they were certainly doing 2+ hours in the gym. And Primo was probably the base of those cycles for sure.
Yeah, so get into why don't you talk a little bit about DECA and maybe some testosterone slash sustanon, Mobster, and how you would
Yeah, so
incorporate
these
those.
actually, in my opinion, here, Stephen. Of course, regular listeners will know that I've used the Nandrolone and Decanate, and I've used their Sustanon 250 and love both those products when I've bulked up. I again have trained for strength, but arguably you could also benefit from a moderate volume approach if you're a bodybuilder from using both these products. Older guys, especially those of us with a few injuries, love Deca because of the mild. It doesn't actually fix anything. It allows you to do more on cycle. And moderate amounts. You don't need to be doing crazy. I've used 1 mil of each, which is roughly 250 milligrams, so about 500 milligrams total every 4/5 days, which averages out to around 700, 750, 800 milligrams a week over the 7 day period, especially if it's every 4 days, Steve. And again, I would blow up like a motherfucker. I've talked about this multiple times. And again, the Deca's helping a little bit with this discomfort, etc., from brutal training. And of course, I'm bringing PEDs, the Sus Deca, towards the end of the strength training cycle. But even for the bodybuilder, using what we could call a working percentage of 1 rep max with a sensible amount of volume that's actually stimulating muscle growth, would do incredibly well on these because it's literally going to come down to how uncomfortable the pumps. I've never had an uncomfortable pump on either of these products. I've not had that Anavar pump where my shins were on fire or my lower back was absolutely killing me and I've had to sit down, rehydrate, take some more taurine or an organ protector with taurine in it and just to get dissipate the pumps. I've had and used many times Dynabol and Anavar and Dynabol, again, pleasurable pumps. I think I did it all day long arm workouts, these 16 workouts in 8 hours doing something like that. So that was a stupidly high volume just for one day as an experiment. I love those. And there's a million listeners that have used some sort of testosterone, whether it's cypionate or enanthate or even a propionate, again from Euro Pharmacies as a base for their cycle. So here's the thing again, right? My strength athlete buddies would use an enanthate circa 500 milligrams a week, Steve, but they would almost certainly include a small amount of tren towards the end of their strength training. Their volume would be, for the most part, higher percentage of 1 rep max, low volume compared to bodybuilders. But how many bodybuilders out there, Steve, have built amazing physiques, even average Joe's transformative physiques, with circa 500 milligrams of testosterone, and then something like Winstrol or Equipoise as a very, very simple. I give an example again, Steve, and we've talked about how certain drugs, Tren and EQ being the classic example, were quote unquote veterinary drugs. Well, in fact, of course, they were used in humans and then switched over. But as an example, and just to illustrate the point, we've talked about EQ, Equipoise, being a drug, which of course it was also used for in horse flesh and specifically horse racing and horse breeding. We are not talking about the horses that are dragging a plough across the field. We're talking about the thoroughbreds that are muscular beasts, functional, as stallions for one reason, or as race horses, being pound for pound incredibly good at what they did. And if you look at them, quivering muscles all over that horse flesh, and of course, very high value animals. He wasn't giving it to the average horse that people go for a short ride around the countryside in, Steve. They're giving it to high-end, high-value horses in the same way that Tren was given to cattle to increase muscular mass and therefore more beef on the bone, and therefore a greater sale when it went to market, and then of course went to the slaughterhouse to be turned into beef. So you look at these things, you see how they're being used, and you go, how can I apply all that to myself as a human being? And you work out, for example, with the EQ, it shouldn't fuck up your endurance, and therefore it might actually help you somewhat. Maybe not as much as surrounded by, but help you a little bit with the higher volume approach. Windstroll, for example, I would actually argue does not. Not because necessarily it is something that fucks up your endurance or stops a high volume, but just because of, for example, the drying out of the joints. And the more volume you do, the more joint pain you're going to get. And that's just a very, very simple analogy. So talk about what the average Joe would use to build muscle, again, from the Euro Pharmacies line, Steve, on a normal amount of volume.
Yeah,
Just from
another
your
one.
point of view.
Yeah, well, this is another one. This would be great for someone who's doing like a first, second, third cycles equipoise. And your pharmacies, they have an excellent equipoise, and you touched on it. But that would be a good option, Monster. And you could stack it with a little testosterone, or you could do Primo with a little testosterone. Those would be both really, really good options. I would do 400 milligrams of either the Primo or equipoise, and then you could stack 100, 150, or 200 milligrams of the test with it. And then the Trenbolone, I touched on it earlier. Now, this is an advanced steroid, but Euro Pharmacies has many different Trenbolone options. They have the ACE, they have the E, they have a Tritren, they have blends that include uh, Trenbolone. And these are really, really good options. And one of the ways that you can use Tren if you wanted to go high volume is stack it with some Masteron, or you could stack it with some Winstrol, and that would be a really good option. And then in either situation, if you wanted to go that route, if you wanted to bulk up and get stronger, you could do it with some testosterone. You could do it with one of the orals that we touched on, maybe the Anavar, for example. That would be a good option as well. So really, no wrong way to do it, Mobster. Any final thoughts on any of these steroids we've talked about before we move on the
Yeah,
Euro-Pharma?
the only thing that just occurred to me, Steve, as you was talking, is, and I've actually seen this for myself, the more ectomorphic the physique, and I'm actually thinking of my local gym owning buddy in terms of the amount of PEDs, which I know he's used, and even sometimes slightly tongue in cheek, the volume that he said he's used. I'll throw Monster under the bus here in terms of the very high amounts of PEDs he used. It's weird in that the ectomorphic type physique with the low volume approach to training that we've suggested and a higher percentage of one rep max might arguably be less sensitive to low amounts of testosterone, and in order to transform the physiques might actually want to manipulate the variables in terms of the milligrams per week. And I'm talking about all steroids. So when I say testosterone, I'm going to cover every single steroid: Tren, EQ, Winstrol, la la. And what you might sometimes see there is that you start with what we would call a sensible, safe amount, and then maybe over time increase it, especially as you get closer to your big numbers on just growing muscle. You're getting closer to your genetic ability to grow, to get strong, etc., etc. So what I will sometimes see there, Steve, and I'm generalizing when I say this, that the more ectomorphic you are, the more you might need a slightly higher amount of milligrams total of total steroids per week than, for example, the mesomorph. The mesomorph, again, genetic freaks, athletic physique, will probably do incredibly well on everything, low or high amounts. And the endo, the more fat slash heavy boned, etc. physique, probably doesn't need as much as you think. And again, I'm generalizing when I say that. So, for example, and again, this is a very oversimplification by way of explanation before we move on to talk about Euro Pharmacies itself. It might mean the difference between endo, heavy bone, fatter, only needing 800 milligrams total per week versus, for example, the true ectomorph, who's changed the volume approach to what we talked about, worked on their food, worked on the diet, and they might, for example, be 2, 3, 400 milligrams more. It's the reasons why, if you come onto the forums and you check out the logs, member number 1 is doing 1200 milligrams total, member number 2 is doing 600 milligrams total, and yet they're both getting great results. Sometimes there's a little bit about the receptor science in there, but that's mostly overstated. It's more on the diet and the training, and specifically that they're not overtraining. In both examples, their training is where they need it to be, their volume is where they need it to be, their food's on point, their food prep's on point, but you see a difference in milligrams total purely and simply because one has a physique that's more ectomorphic and one that's more endomorphic. And that's just as an example. And again, if Steve was working with a client, that's the kind of stuff that we'd be looking at. You used to ask for wrist size and elbow size and ankle size and all those kind of things, and then how long trading, PED experience, etc. Let's talk about, Steve, just to finish now, Euro Pharmacies. Why are they a great source? Well, bearing in mind the conversation of the day and the subject of the podcast, they have something for everyone. They have something for the low volume approach, the medium volume approach, the high volume approach. They have something for the exo, the endo, and the meso. For example, and Steve's touched upon this when we talk about other shows, they have growth hormone, they have ancillaries, they have all the testosterones. They've switched recently to a lot of their products, Steve, which we've discussed on other shows, are now in the 15 milligram format. Sorry, 15 milliliter format, i.e. the bigger vials. These are typically dosed at the same kind of doses that you actually use on cycle. So, for example, 200 milligrams of one product or 300 milligrams of another product. I use, as you know, regular listeners will know, their Tesipinate is my TIT. That I've used just recently, Steve, for the cycle that I'm literally just finishing this week. Their Sustanon and their Deca, 250 milligrams of each every 5 days on the current cycle. And again, those are from the 10 and 15 mil vials. So they have all the things that you want. You're looking at a clean product, like Steve said earlier on. You're looking at a properly dosed product. You can see on the forum, as well as on the website themselves, as well as on the reseller sites, copies of the certificates of analysis. They have amazing reps. The customer service is on point. Talk briefly, Steve, before we finish, about your opinion of Euro Pharmacies yourself as well.
Yeah, Euro Pharmacies, they've been around a long time. We've had their products tested independently. We've had their blood work taken after using their products. So we know their products are on point. We know that they're dosed correctly. They have excellent shipping options, fast. They have excellent customer service, and it's very easy to order from them. You come on our forum, and you'll find out how that you can order from them. Come on evolution.org, and you'll find out exactly how to get Euro Pharmacies products. And they're excellent. When you order from them, you know you're getting what you're ordering, and that's very, very important. I mean, you don't. I can tell you when I first got into this, I was ordering stuff that wasn't what I wanted. I'd order Anavar that was really Dynabol. I'd order Primo that was really Deca or testosterone. Very frustrating.
Or underdose, Steve, or nothing in
so
it
they
whatsoever.
make it so easy, and they have excellent reps on the forum that are there to help you if there's ever a problem. So you can't beat it. You can't beat it. We're so lucky today to have an excellent brand like Euro Pharmacies. And that's why, we talk about Euro Pharmacies for that reason. And they're solid. I'm telling you, they are solid.
20 plus years in industry, Steve, sold by the biggest resellers that we know, 2 or 3 of the top resellers. And I don't know every reselling company, but 2 or 3 of the top resellers in the world have Euro Pharmacies as one of their number 1, number 2 brands. You can talk about the sheer products that they've developed, the way that they're trying to redevelop and update their line all the time. They're absolutely open. If the product's slightly underdosed, 94 milligrams when it should be 100, they tell you. They're not pretending it's 100 when it's a little bit underdosed. They've got other products that's slightly overdosed. And this literally with randomized products have been taken from the product line and as Steve independently tested, never mind in-house or even sent out by the company to independent labs, but literally by customers that have tested their product. One of the things that I always say in regards to these shows, just before we finish, is that Steve and I could be quite properly accused of a bias. So I always say it's that classic line now, Steve, about doing your own research. And the great advantage you will have with a company like Euro Pharmacies, it's not just Steve and I talking about a company like this on this show and explaining why we think their products are great. We say, don't just ask us. Go away and look elsewhere. Go to other forums. Go offline. Look at independent reviews. Go and the number on the certificates of analysis, the lab test, you can contact the lab yourself. You can see the name of the lab that was used, and you can work out for yourself by contacting them, by asking for independent reviews from other places and other sources. Is this company good to go? People will always, and I include Steve and I, always have companies that we like to work with. And we like to work with, for example, Euro Pharmacies, because we've used their product and because we trust their product. So if we say ask someone else and they tell you it's a great source. Oh, but I prefer source B or source C. But they say that they know that Euro Pharmacies is a good brand. Then you know that what we've said is correct. That you know what we said is legitimate. And Euro Pharmacies is a legitimate company, produces solid products that you will absolutely get great results from. And that's the reason why we recommend it. And again, just to finish, they have something for high volume, medium volume, low volume. Have a think about what we've talked about today. Does your training need a little bit of a tweak? Do you need to take a couple of sets out, reduce the volume a little bit to increase hypertrophy, to grow more muscle, to get stronger? Are you training according to your physique type? Do you need to up this small amount or even lose a little bit from the amount of milligrams that you're using per week of certain products available from Euro Pharmacies in order to get better results? Make sure that your training is producing positive results. It's not just you going to the gym and killing it, but doing 22 sets for arms when you could benefit with 16. Or maybe you need to go from 16 to 22. Have a look at what you're doing, see if it's producing results, and think about what we've discussed today. Let us know your opinions. Does it work for you? Come onto the forum, talk about it in the comments below. Please note, we are not doctors and the opinions are ours, is our view based on our experience and views on the topic. And podcasts are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.